The Ballad of Jebediah Jeb. Chapter 1, The Shadow of the Vulture. The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Harmony Gulch like a blacksmith's hammer on hot iron. It was the kind of heat that made a man spit sizzle on the parched earth and turned the midday sky into a shimmering mirage. Jebediah Jeb, a man as weathered and unforgiving as the landscape itself, rode into town with the silhouette of a vulture circling overhead. His Stetson was pulled low, shadowing eyes as cold and grey as a winter storm. He was a man with a past as dark as the gun belt strapped around his hips, and a grudge heavier than the saddlebags slung across his weary horse. Jeb dismounted in front of the Golden Nugget Saloon, the swinging doors momentarily clearing the air of the thick haze of whiskey and cheap tobacco that clung to the establishment like a second skin. All eyes turned to him, the murmur of conversation dying down to a hushed silence. They knew Jeb. Or, at least, they knew of him. He was a legend whispered around campfires, a tale of vengeance and retribution. He strode towards the bar, his spurs clinking a rhythmic beat on the wooden floor. The bartender, a portly fellow with a handlebar mustache that quivered with every nervous gulp, shuffled over, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. "Whiskey," Jeb growled, his voice rough as gravel. "And make it snappy." As the bartender hastily poured the amber liquid, Jeb's eyes scanned the room, settling on a man in the corner, playing cards with a group of rough-looking cowboys. The man was younger than Jeb, with a slick mustache and a fancy waistcoat. His name was Clay Dalton, and he was the reason Jeb had come to Harmony Gulch. 20 years ago, Dalton had ridden with Jeb's brother, Ethan, a good man with a heart as big as the Montana sky. They were partners, friends, brothers in every sense but blood. But Dalton was a snake in the grass, a man with greed in his heart and treachery in his soul. He had betrayed Ethan, leaving him to die in a Comanche ambush, all for a sack of gold. Jeb had buried his brother with his own hands, the image of Ethan's lifeless eyes forever burned into his memory. He swore that day, on his brother's grave, that he would find Dalton and make him pay. Now, after years of searching, he had finally found his prey. Chapter 2, The Ghosts of Yesterday. The saloon was a tinderbox of tension. Every man in the room could feel the palpable shift in the atmosphere, the air thick with anticipation. They knew Jeb, and they knew what he was capable of. Dalton, oblivious to the impending storm, continued his card game, his laughter echoing through the tense silence. Jeb downed his whiskey in one gulp, the fiery liquid a mere spark compared to the inferno raging within him. He slammed the glass on the bar, the sound cutting through Dalton's laughter like a gunshot. Dalton turned, his eyes widening with recognition. The blood drained from his face, leaving him as pale as a ghost. He knew why Jeb was here. The past had finally caught up with him. "Dalton," Jeb's voice boomed through the saloon, each syllable laced with venom. "It's been a long time." Dalton stumbled back, his chair clattering to the floor. Fear danced in his eyes, but a flicker of defiance remained. "Stone," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't expect to see you here." "No," Jeb said, his voice low and menacing. "You didn't. But I reckon you knew this day would come." He slowly approached Dalton, his spurs clinking a death knell on the wooden floor. The other cowboys scattered, leaving Dalton standing alone, trapped in the spotlight of Jeb's wrath. "You took something from me, Dalton," Jeb continued, his voice a guttural growl. "Something I can never get back." Dalton's hand instinctively moved towards his gun, but Jeb was faster. He drew his Colt Peacemaker with lightning speed, the hammer cocking back with a sharp click that echoed through the silent saloon. "Don't," Jeb warned, his voice cold and steady. "Don't even think about it." Dalton froze, his hand hovering over his holster. He knew he was outmatched. Jeb was the fastest drawer in the West, a reputation earned through years of hardship and bloodshed. "You're going to pay for what you did, Dalton," Jeb said, his voice devoid of emotion. "You're going to pay with your life." Chapter 3, A Dance with the Devil. The standoff seemed to stretch on for an eternity, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall and the heavy breathing of the two men. The air was thick with tension, the silence punctuated by the occasional nervous cough from the onlookers. Dalton's eyes darted around, desperately searching for an escape. But there was none. He was trapped, caught in the web of his own past sins. "Please, Stone," he pleaded, his voice cracking. I was young. I made a mistake." "Mistake?" Jeb spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Leaving a man to die is not a mistake. It's a sin. And you're going to pay for it." Dalton's face contorted in a mixture of fear and desperation. He knew his pleas were falling on deaf ears. Jeb Stone was a man of his word, a man who lived by a code as old as the West itself. "I'll give you one chance, Dalton," Jeb said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Draw." Dalton hesitated, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. He knew he was no match for Jeb in a gunfight, but pride and a desperate hope for survival urged him to fight. With a sudden surge of adrenaline, Dalton drew his gun. But Jeb was faster. His Colt roared, the sound deafening in the confined space of the saloon. Dalton's gun clattered to the floor, his hand clutching his chest, blood blossoming through his fingers. He staggered back, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked at Jeb, his lips moving but no words coming out. Then, with a final groan, he collapsed to the floor, the life draining from his eyes. The silence in the saloon was absolute. The onlookers watched in stunned silence as Jeb holstered his gun, the smoke curling from the barrel like a phantom. He looked down at Dalton's lifeless body, his face impassive. "It's done," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He turned and walked out of the saloon, the swinging doors closing behind him with a finality that echoed the end of a long and bloody chapter. The vulture, still circling overhead, seemed to let out a mournful cry as Jeb mounted his horse and rode out of Harmony Gulch, disappearing into the vast expanse of the Wild West. Epilogue: The weight of the past. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the plains. Jeb rode on, his silhouette a lonely figure against the fiery sky. He had avenged his brother's death, but the victory felt hollow. The years of consuming hatred had taken their toll, leaving him empty and weary. He thought of Ethan, his brother's laughter echoing in the chambers of his heart. He wondered if Ethan would have approved of what he had done. He wondered if the cycle of violence would ever end. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jeb rode on, his horse's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. He was a man forever marked by the past, a man who had learned that revenge was a double-edged sword, capable of cutting both ways. He carried the weight of his actions like a heavy burden, a constant reminder of the darkness that lurked within him. But he also carried the memory of his brother, a beacon of light guiding him through the wilderness of his soul. Jebediah Stone, the man who had lived by the gun, was riding towards an uncertain future, hoping to find a measure of peace in the vast and unforgiving landscape of the Wild West. If you are enjoying the Western Echoes, Cowboy Tales Unleashed channel, hit the subscribe button for future posts.